We're now on Daf Mem Heyom and Beis, and we're trying to identify that point where the brain begins to extend beyond the cranium, which contains it. And at that point, it's called the Chut HaShidra. And the Gemara explains that there are two, shall we say, structures that look like, I have it in a diagram here, like two beams that are lying at the entrance to the cranium. And there's nerve tissue that lies from these beams inward, and that is called Hapulin Vilifnim. It's the inside of the cranium, and therefore it's part of the brain. But then there's a part that lies from the beams outward, and that's reckoned as outside the cranium, and that's called the Chut HaShidra. Pulin Atzman, with regard to the beings themselves, right? Not lifnim and not lachutz. I don't know the halacha. Mistabra, however, it would seem likely that it should be considered like it's inside the cranium and therefore it's the brain. Rabbi Yirmiyah Badak Ofa, he checked out a bird, the Ashkach, and he found Kimin Shnei Polin Munachim Al Pia Kedera, structures that look like two beams at the entrance to the cranium. And now we get to a discussion about the lev, and then to the re'ah. Nikev al-lev lebeis chalolo. Right, the heart is made up of two chambers, which are called in Hebrew beis chalolo. And the word chalolo means a chamber of cavity. And if there was punctured in its chamber of cavity, the animal's a treifa. What does that mean? Boy, Rab Zera vacillated. Lebeis chalal katan, lebeis chalal gadol. There are two chambers of the heart. There's a small chamber, and there's the large chamber. The heart consists of a large central chamber surrounded by a small chamber. The large central chamber is flanked by smaller chambers, as we said before. The larger left one and the smaller is on the right one. Okay. Abaye tries to resolve the issue of Reb Zera. Mighty boilcha. I don't understand the question at all. Milo Tanan, our Mishnah says, and now we're switching from the heart to the lungs. Rabbi Shimon Omer ad shetinokev lebeis hasimponos. Okay, the beis hasimponos, otherwise known as the chamber of the bronchi. So Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion the animal is not a treif with regard to the hole in the lungs, unless the hole penetrates all the way to the bronchi. And Amarav Ad shetinokev lesimpon gadol. We were going to interpret Reb Shimon's statement that the animal is not considered a treifa unless the hole penetrates to one of the primary bronchi. Now, I have a picture here of the symponos, the bronchi of the lungs. The largest of the bronchi is indicated not by the expression chamber, but rather by the fact that it is called the chamber of the bronchi in the plural. So that's where the bronchi converge. So what's the analogy here? Just as Reb Shimon's expression of Beis Hasimponos, the chamber of the bronchi, refers to the largest of the bronchi, meaning the primary bronchi. So too, when the Mishnah uses the expression of Beis Halal, of the heart, then the chamber of the cavity should be interpreted to mean the largest of the heart's cavities. Hachi the Gemara says that's not a good analogy. Hasam, over there in the case of the lungs, lebesa symponos ketoni. Right, the word is symponos, bronchi in the plural. And since the chamber of the bronchi in the plural, the implication is lehecha de shofche symponos kulu. That's the place where all the other bronchi converge. And that's the primary bronchi. As we said, the largest of the bronchi. But hacha here, in the case of the cavities of the heart, lebeis chalolo ktani, it says it in the singular. Mali chalol gadol, mali chalol katon. What difference does it make whether it's a large cavity or a small cavity? Both types are referred to by this expression. Therefore, the law is that the animal's a treifa if a hole penetrates any of the heart cavities. Knei alev. Now, what's exactly the knei alev? We don't know yet, but hopefully we'll figure it out. Rav Omer b'mashu, Shmuel Omer b'ruba. Okay, so what's the knei alev, about which there was a controversy? Which puncture will render the animal a treifa? Hai ninu knei alev. Omer Rav. Chelev shalgabe defanos, which literally translates as the fats that are on the walls. So the walls refer to the sides of the animal, meaning that when we're speaking of a puncture or a tear in the fat that runs from the spinal column down the sides of the ribs. What? Down the sides of the ribs? So chelev means fat, animal fat. And there's animal fat that's prohibited, which is called chelev. There's animal fat that's permitted, that's called shuman. And Chazal use the term shuman to distinguish between these two varieties of fat. But that's not really the point of our sugya. The main point of our sugya is about the defanos. Defanos salke daitach. Do you really believe that we're speaking of the defanos, the walls on the sides of the animal? The fat that runs down those walls is surely not vital at all. How can a puncture in the fat, in that fat that runs down the sides of the walls of the animal could be considered, could render the animal as a treifa ella, but rather, what does it mean when we say al gabi defanos? Shal gabi dofne rea. Wow. Dofne rea. We're talking about the lave. But we're talking about the pipe of the heart, and that's called the fat on the walls of the lungs. In other words, the pipe of the fat that runs between the two lungs and is pressed against the spine and connected to the heart cavity. Omar Ameimar Bishmeider of Nachman, Tlasa Konihavi. There are three pipes that branch off from the windpipe after it enters into the chest of the animal. Chad Parish Lili, but one goes off to the heart. Chad Parish L'Rea, one goes off to the lungs. The Chad Parish L'Kavta to the liver. And therefore, we're going to apply the following principle: de rea kirea, de kavda kikavda, that the pipe of the lung is treated like the lung itself, and therefore the slightest puncture makes it into a nekev, into a treifa. The pipe of the liver is treated like the liver itself. And unless the entire liver is removed, then it's not a treifa. The liba, but the pipe of the heart, that's where Rav and Shmuel have machlokes pligi. Mar bar chia mas neibcha. He has the exact opposite. The reisha bekavda, the pipe of the lung, is treated like the liver, and therefore the pipe of the lung is not treifa unless it was completely removed. The kavda kireya, the pipe of the liver, is treated like the lung, and therefore it's rendered treifa by the slightest puncture. To liba pliga, and there's machlokes between the Rav and Shmuel regarding the pipe of the heart. Also, Rav Chia bar Yosef, Amar l'Shmaita de Rav Kame de Shmuel, he reported the teaching of Rav that the pipe of the heart is considered a treifa by the slightest puncture, even a nekev. And it was told to Shmuel. Amar le, Shmuel says, Ihachi, Amar Abba, if that's really what Abba, meaning Rav, said, lo yoda b'treifus lo klum, then Rav doesn't know a thing about treifus. Okay, now we get to the shidra, the breaking in the spinal column, which makes the animal into a treifa. Chut hashidra shenifsak berubo, if the spinal cord was severed in its majority, then Rebbe says it is a treifa. Rabbi Yaakov Omar, no. If you're talking about the spinal cord, afilu nikev, even the smallest puncture will make it into a treifa. Now, initially, Rav was the mekil, but yet Hora Rebbe ki Rebbe Yaakov. I said Rav, I meant to say Rebbe. Rebbe changed his mind apparently, and when it came to Psak, he accepted the Chumrah of Rabbi Yaakov, that any puncture in the spinal cord renders the animal as a treifa. But nevertheless, the Gemara concludes that we're going to accept l'halach, the original position of Rebbe, Amar Rav Huna ein halachic Rabbi Yaakov. Okay, so now we've established that the animal is only rendered a treifa if the majority of the spinal cord is severed. V'kama rubo. Which part of the spinal cord are you going to measure in order to determine that it's majority? And apparently there's part of the spinal cord that goes all the way down towards the tail of the animal, and that's not vital. Is Rav Amar Rov Oro, the Amrile Rov Mocho. So according to the first tradition, Rav said that the majority of the circumference of the skin, if it's severed, the animal's treifa, even if the nerve tissue inside was not separated at all. But according to the second tradition, a majority of its nerve tissue, not the skin, but the nerve tissue, is severed. Then the animal becomes a treifa. And he has a picture of it here. Man dioma rov mocho. The one who says that if it's a majority of even the nerve tissue of the spinal cord makes it into a treifa, is how much more so kolshkein rov oro, if the majority of its skin was severed. That makes the animal a treifa. Because the protection here for the chut hashidra is the nerve tissue. And if the nerve tissue is severed, then everything's going to deteriorate. And every liquid that keeps it going is going to ooze out. But on the other hand, leman dioma rov oro, rov mocho mai, we don't know what would be the law if the majority of the nerve tissue was severed. Because this man, the is saying it's the majority of its skin. And Tashma, I'll prove it to you. The Amar Nilvi Amar of Huna, Rubo Shamru Rov Oro. That with regard to the severing of the spinal cord, the majority which makes it into a treifa is referring to Rov Oro. Moach Zelo Mailav Morit. The nerve tissue, which is enclosed by the skin, is severed. That doesn't matter at all. It doesn't make things either better or worse. Anyway, we see that when we talk about rubo, we're referring to the majority of the R, and a severing of the nerve tissue does not render the animal treifa. And let's corroborate this from the following story. Rabbi Nosson bar Ovin Havi Yosef Kami de Rav Bodak Berov Oro. And if there was an injury to the spine of the animal, and after they slaughtered the animal, they wanted to ascertain whether it was a treifa or not, then Rav would be bodek. He would examine whether the majority of the skin had been severed. But yet, Rav wasn't satisfied with that examination. Kabbadik, he did a second examination, Berov Mocho. And he checked out the nerve tissue as well. And only when he determined that neither of them had been severed, then he was machshir the animal. Omer le im rov orokaya mocho ze eno ma'il v'lo morid. If the majority of the circumference of a skin is intact, then whether or not the nerve tissue is severed is irrelevant. Omar Rabba Bar Bar Chana Omar Nismorech Posel, Nismasmes Posel. So now we're talking about the nerve tissue of the spinal cord, and there are two possibilities here. Number one is Nismorech, it's liquefied, and the animal is therefore a treifa. And the other possibility is nismasmes, it's softened, and that also makes it into a treifa. When do you call it liquefying? When do you call it softening? Liquefying means where it pours like a jug of water, and masmasa is called sheidu yochel lamo. The animal can't stand. The nerve tissue has become liquid to the degree that the spinal cord cannot stand upright. Boy, Rabbi Yomi vacillated on the following question. What if the spinal cord thickened so that it can't stand upright on account of its weight? Does that fall under the heading of softening and therefore renders the animal treifa? Take Bei Rav Omri, Nismasmes posel, however, Nismasmeg kosher. If it lost its substance on its own, it is still kosher. Meisvei, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Behemosh and Nismasmes mocha treifa. If the nerve tissue lost its substance, it's a treifa. And that contradicts Rav's teaching that the mere loss of substance from the nerve tissue of the spinal column cord does not render the animal treifa. And the Gemara says that's not a kash at all. Hahi nismasmes itmar. In that brisa, it's nismasmes, it's softened, and not nismasmes, as you quoted it when you asked the kasha. Eni, is this really so that a loss of nerve tissue does not render the animal treifa? V'ha levi aviyosiv be'mesusa. A lot of stories in the Gemara about what goes on in the bathhouse. Anyway, Chaziel Ugavra did Tari L'Reisha. He saw a certain man never had a concussion in his head. His head apparently smashed into a wall. Omar Nismazme's Moche Dede. Levi exclaimed, "The brain of this fellow has lost its substance." And assuming Lav Delochai, doesn't he mean that this man is going to die? And that would contradict Rav's teaching that the loss of nerve tissue does not render the animal treif. Amar Abaye lo. That's not what Levi was saying. Lomar sheina molid, he cannot father a child. The brain damage that he suffered would render him sterile. Okay, so now we said the upper limit of the spinal cord is at the entrance to the cranium. And we described the various defects of the spinal cord that render the animal treifa. Now the Gemara wants to know, what about the lower limit of the spinal column? Ad heichan chut hashidra, Rav Yehuda Marav, ad bein haparoshos, between the branches. The spinal cord begins to branch out above the animal's hind legs. So really like towards the tail of the animal. One branch of the cord going down to one leg, another branch going down to the other leg, and the middle branch of these three branches continues down the spine towards the tail. After two etzbos further back, the cord begins branching into three and further back again, so it continues to branch until the end. If the spinal cord is severed anywhere between the brain and the place of these branches, the animal is a treifa. If it was severed, if the spinal cord was severed below the place of the branches, the animal is not a treifa. The cord has been severed at a point where its vital force is weaker. The loins of the animal support the spine, and the injury is not fatal. The branches are called paroshos. And I have a very nice diagram here. Anyway, now more details of that which Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. Rav Dimi bar Yitzchak Havi Kaboy lemezel lebeichas. He wanted to get to Beichas. Also lekame Rabbi Yehuda. He said he came from Amalei and he said to him, "Lichave li mar ben aproshosecha." Can you please demonstrate to me? Let's bring an animal after it was slaughtered and show me where is this area that's called between the branches. Amalei, Rabbi Yehuda says to him, Zil Aisili Gedi, fetch me a Gedi, a kid, and a young goat. And I'll show you. Okay, Aisili Gedi Shmeina. First they brought him a fat Gedi, kid. Amalei Rav said, no, this is not going to do it. We cannot check out, and I can't teach you about Rabbi Yehuda's ruling in a case of a fat kid, because blia tfei v'lo yadia. The bein, right? The bein haproshos. Split the language again. Bein haproshos is embedded too deeply in the fat, and it's not sufficiently discernible. So I see lei kochish. Then Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, we'll bring a lean king. Oh, can't help you with that one either. Amalei, v'liton tfei. The hip bones protrude too much in this very skinny, lean kid, v'lo yaduya. And once again, I can't discern where the Bein HaProshos are. Amalei, so Rabbi Yehuda turns to me and says, Ta agrach gemara. You know what? We don't have any more kids to bring you. Just teach me the oral tradition without a show and tell, without a visual demonstration. Hachi Amar Shmuel, an achas treifa, a break in the spinal cord, anywhere from the neck until the first section of cord between the branches renders the animal treifa. Shlishis, kshera. In other words, lower down, which is the third section, then the animal's kshera. Shniya ain't yodeh. If you ask me about the middle of the three of these bein haproshos, then I can't tell you if this is treifa or not. I simply don't know. Let's try to finish this up very quickly. Boy, Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yeshua. So we now have Rav Huna asking the following question. Shmuel said that if there's a break in the spinal cord, anywhere from the neck until the first section of the cord, between the branches, bein haproshos, the animal's a treifa. Did he mean ad bichlal, meaning that even this first section, if there's a break, then the animal's a treifa? Dilma ad v'lo bichlal. What he meant is up into, but not including that first section. And we'll finish up with Boy Rav Papa, even though there are other sfeikas here. But Boy Rav Papa, even if I grant you that ad v'lo ad bichlal, that anything at the bein haproshos itself would not render the animal a treifa, and that's a kula. Even if I were to grant you that, things are still not clear. Why? Because pi parasha mal. What's the din regarding the mouth of the branch, the juncture of the first branch, where the two side nerves branch off from the spinal cord? Is that included in the portion that precedes the first section, and it's a treifa, or is it included in the area of safek? Okay, then this is where we'll stop for today, and I wish you a very fine week.
Yeah, very difficult.
Yeah, we're trying our best. It's
I know. Not easy.
no, it's
Not
just
even shkoyach.
I was thinking of skipping the whole parak, but I'm trying to do the Daf Yomi, which I started
Yeah,
five
I know.
years ago. So I'm trying to do the best I can. I need a crash course in anatomy, which
I know. That's why it's so hard.
I don't think that's relevant to the course you taught last Sunday, which was probably more
No.
mathematics. But anyway, okay, call it.
Yeah.